This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support truly helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Well, my guest today, Chris Pearson, was born in Tehran, Iran to American parents. He grew up in the D.C. area and attended Northern Virginia Community College. He co-created and wrote the bulk of the animated comedy show Dan Versus, which ran on the Hub Network for 3 seasons. In his capacity as executive producer, Chris was nominated for Daytime Emmy Awards in 2013 and 2014. Recently, he wrote an episode of the Netflix series Buddy Thunderstruck and is currently writing full-time for NowThis Politics. For those reasons and so many more, I'm truly thrilled to welcome the great writer Chris Pearson to StoryBeat today. Chris, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get into a little of your history. What were your earliest inspirations? How did you get into this thing called writing?
What were my earliest inspirations?
Why did you become a writer?
I think I always wanted to write something. I was always a big reader, and I think on some level I always wanted to try to do the thing that I was enjoying so much.
Mm-hmm.
I think that for movies and TV, it was actually the movie Clerks. It was the first time I watched something and I realized that somebody, probably with not too different sensibility from myself, had to sit down and write that before. You just watch TVs and movies, and as a casual observer, you don't think about it as something that someone writes.
Clerks, that's not Kevin Smith, is it?
Oh, yeah,
Kevin
that one.
Smith.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sensibility of sort of, it's not really a play, it's a little bit more lifelike and natural, that appealed to you.
Yeah, and also when I was writing fiction, the part that I always got stuck on was the description. I always enjoyed the dialogue and the interaction between characters a little bit more than describing what the room looked like.
So you think of yourself as a dialogue person more than a narrative structure person?
I would say overall, yeah.
But yet stories are a structure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I love telling stories. I just, I would much rather say interior apartment crappy and get on with the characters talking to each other.
And let the artists figure it out.
Right.
Because especially when you're doing animation, you have that good grace. But even if you're doing live action, you've got production designers.
Set designers,
and so on.
yep.
Sure. All right. So at what age did you start to write?
Well, I was writing short stories and stuff. I mean, back in elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote my first screenplay, I was probably about 20.
20. And was that in a school or on your own?
That was just on my own.
And so you just had a fascination for it. Were you always a student of movies and TV?
I always liked movies and TV. I wouldn't say that I started studying anything that went into making them at all. I think I read Frank Capra's biography or something like that, but I didn't start reading about writing screenplays until I started writing my first one.
All right, so nobody trained you to do this?
No.
You just started reading screenplays and emulating that form?
Yes, and then a couple years later, I took a screenwriting class with my grandmother at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland.
She wasn't teaching it, she was taking
Nope.
it with you?
We took it together. I wrote a Northern Exposure, and she wrote a Picket Fences, maybe?
Picket Fences?
Yeah.
And so has that script been of any value to you other than it was a good training?
That was it.
That was it. You didn't use it as a spec for anything?
No, I'm not even sure I finished it.
But so you enjoyed the process?
Yeah.
And I think that's what this show focuses on is process.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't enjoy the process of writing in the first place and writing screenplays in the second place as a screenwriter, it would kind of be torture.
Yes.
So it has to be something that you enjoy, that's for sure.
Or at least don't hate. There's that Irma Bombeck quote about I don't like writing, I like having written.
Oh, well, I'm one of those people too.
Yeah.
I like having written.
Yes.
I don't like the process of sitting there and having to think it. It's hard work, you know.
Yes.
But yet I love having written something.
Mm-hmm.
That's very fulfilling. You find it the same. It's fulfilling.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you didn't go and get formal training anywhere, how many scripts or how much did you work on stuff before you thought to yourself, hey, I'm okay at this?
I'll let you know when I get there.
You and me both.
Yeah. Let's see. When I'd probably written maybe 4 or 5 feature scripts before I decided to move out to LA. And
from Maryland.
From the DC area.
The DC
from
area.
Virginia. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. When I first so when I decided to move out, it was one of those crossroads in life. I had taken the LSAT and done okay, and I was thinking about law school, and I had gone through the entire screening process for Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, and I only had one more interview before I could become a firefighter trainee. I'd done all the physical abilities tests and all that stuff, and then there was going to LA, and I was actually on the phone with the firefighter people and trying to schedule this interview, and I said, I can't do Tuesday, and she said, how about Wednesday? And I said, I'm moving to Los Angeles. And she said, on Wednesday? And I said, no, but we should probably cancel this because I've just decided I'm going to throw all my crap in a car and move cross country.
Was it literally that much of a snap decision? Yeah,
it was. Well, I had this sort of realization that I could always go back and go to law school. I could always, at the time I thought I could always go back and be a firefighter. I've developed a visual condition since then, or at least discovered it. So I didn't have that option. But at the time I thought I always have the option to come back and try these other things. I'm not always going to be at a point in my life where I could just drop everything.
But you could always become a lawyer.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I could. And now that I'm going blind, I could become like Daredevil, right? That's
Yes, you could become like Daredevil. I hope you don't, but because we like you just as you are as a writer. All right, so you have now thought to yourself, I am going to Los Angeles and I'm going to, I assume, get into the entertainment industry somehow.
Yes.
Which you're not the first person to have that thought.
Right.
What was the first thing you did when you got to L.A.? In terms of the business, that is. Not get a sandwich, but
right.
What did you do in terms of having your career go?
I would say the mistake that I made when I first got out there was I assumed that it was going to be all about the writing. So what I did for the first couple of years was actually just hold up in a really crappy apartment in Hollywood. I got there in July of '99, so the big Kodak Center at Hollywood and Highland was actually just a huge pit in the ground, and there were still, a lot of homeless people and drug deals going on Hollywood Boulevard when I got there.
Still are.
Well, I mean,
they've cleaned it up a little.
Yeah.
I got out there in 1976. It was full of addicts and prostitutes.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a couple interesting experiences where somebody's banging on my door at 3 a.m. going like, "Let me in! They're trying to kill me," and stuff like that. So.
Were you living right there in that neighborhood?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, right there. And like I said, I holed up in my apartment, and I got temp jobs, and I worked as everything from accounts payable to I was a cowboy for the LA County Fair.
A cowboy?
Yep. Taught kids how to
actual
rope.
Cowboy?
We had these.
Had you had training in that before?
I got about a day and a half of training before I started.
Instant cowboy.
So we had these hay bales with plastic steers heads on them, and I was teaching kids how to throw a rope around the plastic steer head. Yeah.
Wow. What other jobs did you do? Because that's one of the hallmarks of struggling writers is that if you want to, unless you're independently wealthy to begin with, you must do things to be able to put food on the table and pay the rent.
Yep.
What else did you do?
Well, like I said, there's a lot of temping. I worked at Fox in the Standards and Practices Department. I moved furniture.
You're that guy.
I was I was the assistant to that guy.
Got it.
And then I was there's one time that I was a bodyguard.
Bodyguard? Yeah,
well, somebody that I knew peripherally needed to drive to Las Vegas and pick up $200,000 in cash. Oh. And I'm a big guy, and I guess he thought that having a big guy there would, I don't know what he expected me to do if 6 guys came out of the woodwork and took the money. Would have waved at him, described him to the police later,
or just run.
Yep.
Okay, so you have primarily written comedy. That's your bailiwick.
Mm-hmm.
You don't write drama per se. You write mostly comedy.
Mostly, yeah. I've tried. at one point I told you I tried to write a historical baseball drama about
Yeah.
my great grandfather. It didn't work out well. I find when I don't go for the joke, it's either too soft or it's melodramatic. Whereas I have an internal gauge whether something's funny.
You can tell when something's funny.
Right.
What has that been that way your whole life?
Well, I think everybody thinks they've got an above average sense of humor, but I've always enjoyed comedy.
I'm saying, were you the class clown? Were you a jokester as a kid?
I was.
And so you've always known that that's something that you had at least some talent for, or some appreciation of.
Yeah, I have a very my family's an easy audience and always has been, so I think that they encouraged me in the wrong direction early on.
You have good laughers in the family.
Right.
And so when you did something that was silly or goofy, they laughed.
They did.
And that's helpful, because if they just looked at you like you're a moron, that might tell you something opposite.
I'd be better at writing cringe comedy
Cringe.
if I did that.
Well, you write a little bit of cringe comedy every once in a while.
My comedy makes people cringe. That's not the same thing.
Okay. What's the difference? Tell us the difference between is something that makes people cringe and is cringe comedy.
Well, I think cringe comedy is that awful moment. The other than that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Whereas comedy that makes people, I think the function of comedy is in large part to get people out of their comfort zone and to sort of get them laughing at something that might make them feel a little uncomfortable, but not necessarily because of the social awkwardness of it.
So okay, so when did you immediately after you'd started to write various things early on, did you then start to write comedy?
Yeah, well, I think let's see.
What kind of specs did you write?
So the first, well, I actually went out to LA to try to break into live action features and just sort of ended up in animated TV. But I did write some spec shows.
Guess what?
Yep.
Me too.
Okay, well, there you go.
I fell into animation. I didn't go out there to be in animation, but I enjoyed it. But I fell into it. So I understand that can happen.
Yes.
All right. So what were you writing? Were you just writing features?
Yeah, I wrote a lot of spec scripts also. I was working with a writing partner when I first got out there, and we wrote Frasier episode and just a bunch of stuff. Nothing that ever went into production, but just a bunch of spec scripts for various shows.
Did it get you an agent?
That one actually did not get us an agent. What got us an agent was our feature script that was about the romantic lives. It was a romantic comedy about serial killers.
The romantic lives of serial killers.
Yes.
Was this going to be a series?
No, this was a feature. Yep.
And how did that go? That sounds like a great idea.
We got a lot of meetings on it, and everybody said there's no way we'll ever make this, but we thought it was really funny.
Well, okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. Hollywood is filled with those stories that you just told,
yeah,
where something gets attention, but they have no intention of ever making that thing. But they bring you in because they have other things in mind. Or what else do you have?
Yes.
Right? They come in, they want to know what else you have because we like you as a writer, but this is not for us.
Yeah, and then, of course, years later, like they say, oh, we could never do something with a serial killer as the main character, and then years later,
comes
Dexter. And,
sure.
And,
Sure.
Yeah, so we were just a little too far ahead of the curve on that one, I guess.
That happens, too.
Yeah.
Where you see something 10 years after you came up with the idea, and there it is, full bloom, and you're not involved in it.
Yep.
This happens really commonly as well. But the notion that you must... this is for the listeners who are trying to figure their way out. You must be willing to work on and develop things that may never, ever see the light of day. But those things become, in a marketing sense, what are known as lost leaders, right? So you develop it and hope that it turns into something that they want you to do.
Yes. Well, everything that I've written, I've had the naive hope that it would actually be filmed at some point. But I've written over 20 feature scripts.
Wow.
I've gotten paid for one feature script, and none of them have gone into production.
And would you like to have one go?
Oh, yeah.
Who wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
And you've written 20 of them.
Right.
Do you keep writing them?
I do. Well, for the last year, I've only done the NowThis Politics stuff. It's hard to work a full-time writing job and then, make dinner and put the kids to bed and do the dishes and then sit down in front of the computer again.
Sure. So you only work at night?
Well, so now this is during the day. But then I'm on dad duty as soon as I'm done with it.
All right, so let's talk about NowThis since we're onto it. How does that process work? What do you do on NowThis?
Well, so that was I was actually brought in about a year ago for the midterm elections, and the idea was, so they had brought in order to ramp up for the midterms, they had brought in a bunch of video editors and most of them were great, and some of them just needed a little extra help telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end. So the process there is there are three main things that happen. Either I get a script from one of the video editors just to look over, give them my ideas, or every once in a while I'll do a little restructuring, or generating original scripts that they can then hand off to the video editors, or sometimes they'll give me a half-hour interview with somebody and say, hey, could you find 5 minutes about this topic and make it coherent?
Within an existing interview.
Yeah.
Are you then cutting it as well?
I don't do any of the cutting.
But you make suggestions on where to cut.
Yes, I write the script, and then somebody cuts it according to that script.
Okay, so you're taking existing material, and are you then punching it up in some way? Or you?
That's another thing that I do, yeah. And actually, lately I've been doing candidate profiles. So who is John Hickenlooper? Who is Bernie Sanders?
But with a humorous bent.
Yes. I would say more snarky than humorous.
Snark. Well,
yeah.
Okay. Snark is within the greater umbrella of comedy.
Yes, yeah. Not to split hairs, but yeah.
I mean, if you find it funny, that's the key. That, to me, that's the definition of comedy, by the way.
Yes.
Do you laugh or not? That's the only definition. If you don't laugh, it's not comedy. If you do laugh, it is.
That makes sense.
Okay, good. Glad to hear we're on the same page. All right, so are you working with people online?
Yeah, that's I work from home. The main office is in New York. Then everybody's boss is in San Francisco, so there are teleconferences and stuff like that. But mostly it's an app called Slack. It's
Okay, sure.
kind of like the old AOL chat, almost, if you remember that.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what most of the back and forth is on.
Are you?
Google Docs.
And Google Docs.
Yeah.
Are you on Slack at all times?
Yes.
So are you essentially working in a writer's room only online?
Well, there's no. Let me think. When I turn in a script, there's not sort of I have a supervisor, and he's got a supervisor, and they'll look over the script. But for the most part, there's not really a writing team working on it.
It's just you.
Yeah.
So you're not working to write with anybody.
No, or they'll say, hey, Chris, could you look over this person's script? And I'll give it a look. And, 9 times out of 10, I'm like, hey, it's great. I made 2 tweak suggestions. But
most of the time, it's you're doing something and getting feedback from somebody else.
Right.
Or you're providing feedback to something else.
Right. But there's no group. There's no room.
You're it. You're the chief writer.
Well, yeah, sort of. I have a boss, and I would say that he's.
Is he also a writer?
Yeah, actually, he's he was my first writing partner in L.A., and he's the one who brought me on board to
Got it. So this is the same person that you wrote the scripts with earlier, then?
Yeah, the serial killer comedy, stuff like that.
Got it.
Who is not my writing partner on Dan Versus.
On Dan Versus. We'll
Right.
get to Dan Versus here shortly. So on Now This, it takes you all day. You're on it all day long.
Yeah.
Is 6, 8, 10 hours? What is it per day?
So when I started, it was just a normal 40-hour week, and they after the midterms, we thought they were going to roll me off. I thought it was a short-term temp job.
That sounds like a euphemism for something.
Right.
Roll me off.
So anyway, I'm still there, and they did cut my hours back to 30 hours a week, which is great because, like I said, I'm primary parent for my kids. So.
Because your wife's in
works
school,
out well.
right?
Yes, my wife is in med school. We moved to Pittsburgh about 3 years ago. She is just starting her 4th year of med school now.
So how much more difficult? Well, I guess you've got it locked a little bit in the sense that you are able to work at home and take care of your kids. You don't have to go away for 8 hours a day to some other job and then come home and get the kids.
Right, and pay for childcare and all that.
All that.
Yeah. It works out really well.
I would say that's almost like the perfect situation.
Yes.
Because your kids are old enough where they're off to school, they're not in diapers anymore.
Right.
So
summer's been a little challenging, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I would think it would be.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, you're able to do your job at home without any sweat whatsoever.
Yeah, it's been pretty great.
And not all jobs are like that, obviously.
No.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Dan Versus. What led you to create Dan Versus?
Well, Dan Versus. So my writing partner on that, Dan Mandel.
Let's describe the show first.
Oh yeah.
What is the show about for those who've never seen it?
I would say it was on a kids' Cartoon Network.
Yeah.
But it's a story of a misanthropic arsonist who is wronged in some way at the beginning of every episode, and then he raises his tiny fist to the sky, and whatever it is that's wronged him, there's Dan versus the Wolfman, Dan versus New Mexico. So he raises his fist to the sky, New Mexico, and then he has to get revenge on whatever person, place, or thing instigated.
So it's a show with nonstop revenge.
Yes.
And that's always the motivating factor in pretty much every episode.
Pretty much. Yeah, that's the story engine. And then, Dan also has a lot of other self-destructive tendencies. The character Dan also has a lot of other self-destructive tendencies that come out. And his friend, so the characters are named after the creators of the show, me and Dan Mandel, and my wife, Elise. So the main characters are Dan, Chris, and Elise. And so I should really just make an effort to be clear when I'm talking about the characters,
yes.
when I'm talking about us.
Sure.
So, yeah, and then
not that there aren't crossover potentials between them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So what led you to create the show in the first place?
So the show was originally, my co-creator Dan Mandel had an idea for a show called Dan Versus that was going to be like an Eastbound and Down, sort of a hard R, Dan versus the Neighbors, Dan versus the Mailman, live action sitcom.
Mm-hmm.
And my agent called me and said that Adult Swim was looking for a cartoon. And I said, that Dan Versus thing would be a lot of fun because you could have, whatever. You could set it on the moon if you want to in
Sure.
the animated form. So I called Dan and I said, hey, what do you think about making this a cartoon? And he said, if you can sell it, you can turn it into a puppet show for all I care. And
Dan sounds like he was interested in money.
Well, I think Dan was interested in, he was sort of like, fine, if you can get it done, great, but don't bother me with it otherwise. And so then, we wrote... we wrote a mini Bible. Dan had some cartoons that he'd drawn from way back that we actually were able to cut and paste into our show Bible. And then
is he an artist?
No, he's an actor by trade, but he's a doodler, and so we took some of his doodles and put it in the mini Bible. And then I wrote a couple of. I wrote the first 2 episodes, basically, although we didn't know if we were writing for 11-minute or 22 minutes, so they ended up sort of halfway between.
Right. How many pages in between?
18, I think, 18 or 20.
That's in between.
Yeah. And so, yeah, and then sent it around, and the hatchery, which at the time was headed by Margaret Loesch and Dan Angel.
Yeah.
They optioned us. I think that the guy who found us there, a guy named Sean Gorman, might have been the only person in animation that my agent knew. And so he liked us and brought us in, and they decided to option it. And we shopped it around, and everybody said no. And then a year and a half, 2 years later, everybody in all the Cartoon Networks got fired at the same time, basically, which happens every once in a while, I guess. Like the stars aligned.
Yeah,
and
it does happen that way.
So then we...
and then they play musical chairs and they switch jobs.
Well, in this case, I think a lot of them just left. And then we shopped it around to everybody else, and everyone said no again, except Cartoon Network actually said yes. And then we spent a year in development hell at Cartoon Network, which was one of the worst experiences. It was terrible.
Do you want to explain why, or would you rather not?
No, it was sure. I have no reason not to.
Okay, just so you don't feel uncomfortable talking about anybody specific that did something untoward.
Right. No. So we would have these creative meetings with this executive who I'm not sure what his deal was, but I remember one time. He was saying that they had an internal meeting and they decided to age the characters down to high school.
How old were they to start?
So a lot of the humor comes from the fact that Dan is probably in his late 20s, early 30s,
right,
and old enough to know better, and so he goes flying off the handle.
But somewhat childlike in his approach.
Right. And so I sort of made that point to him. I said, a lot of the humor in this is from the fact that Dan's old enough to know better, and I just worry that if we age him down to high school, like if a 30-year-old is screaming at the top of his lungs, it can be funny. If an 18-year-old is pissed off at the world, that's just kind of what being 18 is.
Yeah.
And he actually glared at me. He gave me a full-on stare down for a 3 count, and then he said, "I don't have a problem with that." And it was a lot like meeting with a Ben Stiller sketch. It was just nuts. And
so. Which, by the way, goes on every day all over Hollywood.
Right. Well, and he's also like, well, just think about when you were 17. I was like, okay, which part of the, premarital sex and drugs and juvenile delinquency are we allowed to show on your children's network? Because I'll write something about when I was 17, but it's not what you think I'm going to write.
And how did he respond?
Well, it was bad all around. And as it turned out, their legal department was as bad as their creative department. So Margaret, the head of the hatchery, would negotiate terms with the business affairs people at Cartoon Network, and then the contract would show up and they'd have completely different terms in them.
Mm-hmm.
And this went on for a year where, I'm banging my head against the wall creatively, and apparently the legal people are banging their heads against the wall. And at the end of that year, Margaret calls us and she said they're starting a new network called The Hub, and they've asked me to run it. So Margaret became the president and CEO of The Hub Network, and she took us with her. And that's how lightning struck and Dan Versus finally got on the air somewhere.
Because The Hub could skew more toward a slightly older audience.
Well, and The Hub could really do whatever they wanted because they were a brand new network. They didn't tend to. They were co-founded by Hasbro, so they had Transformers Prime, and they started with a new G.I. Joe and My Little Pony. But Margaret liked us enough and believed in the show enough that she brought us with her.
So I'm curious. It was a network that was. I guess supported totally by Hasbro.
It was
mostly Hasbro.
It was half Hasbro, half Discovery Kids.
Okay, so was there any pressure on you to do things that resulted in merchandising potential?
No, in fact, we were sort of the show they could point to and say, "See, we're not just Hasbro."
Ah,
yeah.
You were their beard, so to speak,
right?
To say we're not just purely a marketing machine,
right? Their token. There's no commercial value to this.
Because I in my days of writing lots of cartoons, there were many times where I was told you need to put this toy into the show.
Right.
We have this super ray gun, and you need to add it into your episode somewhere.
Yeah, we were the opposite of that. In fact, we did an episode called Dan versus Stupidity, and Dan saw a billboard for a show called Humongobots 4, and the tagline was "Just ignore the story and watch stuff blow up." and it wasn't until went through the script, went through the animatic, everything, and it wasn't until the show actually aired that the executive from the Hub Network wrote us a really angry email about, "I just realized that this could be seen as a dig on Transformers."
Oh, that little slow on the uptake, was he?
She. I thought we were very clear about it, but yeah, I mean, apparently she did not realize that that's what that was, or maybe she had just gotten yelled at from the Hasbro people.
Oh, undoubtedly,
yeah.
Or she was worried she was about to get yelled at by the Hasbro people.
Right.
One of those two, and maybe a little of both. Who knows? All right, so let's talk about the process of making Dan Versus into a show. So you have an idea. It's Dan Mandel comes up with an idea. He says it's Dan Versus.
Right.
And then you sit down and the two of you work that out, what the show was about, that you decided that it was the three characters named Dan, Chris, and Elise?
Well, so Dan, as an actor, wanted to do his own voice. And so we thought that we would have a better chance of that if we named the characters after ourselves. And it turns out we were wrong. And actually, we got some really fantastic voice actors to do the job. So it worked out better for everybody. But that's why the characters were named after us.
Well, voice actors are a unique breed. That's for sure. They do things with their voices that you wouldn't do live. And vice versa. Live actors don't know what to do with their voices when it comes to animation, often.
Well, our cast, our main cast, our three main actors, they've all worked in both
live
sure. action and animated, and so they translate pretty well between the two.
But they absolutely, and that happens frequently. What I'm saying is they're slightly different skill sets within the same
definitely
ballpark.
Yes.
All right, so. How did you decide what to write as a pilot? Was it you that made all the decisions, or did you and Dan make it?
Well, the first couple of episodes, I actually just kind of went off and wrote. I was.
Dan just let you go.
Yeah, pretty much for the first couple. I mean, I sent him my first drafts. He weighed in. He added a bunch of funny lines. But yeah, I think of the first 6 episodes we wrote, I think I did the first draft on 5 of them.
So you came up with the way that the show really was structured and how it worked and what the tone of it was and what the voice of the show was.
Well, Dan and I had discussed what the structure was going to be. It's against the Skyward Scream in the beginning, and then, a long, drawn-out revenge scheme that either ends in a win, lose, or draw, right?
Is it more frequent that it was win, lose, or draw? Which is more frequent?
I think that I think there were a lot of Pyrrhic victories, right? Like a lot of he's technically gotten some measure of revenge so that the audience could feel satisfied the story was over, but it was never like Dan's never in a better place at the end of the episode.
So there was no growth for Dan.
No, none.
Dan remained an immature, angry person.
Once again, I'd like to specify this is the character Dan.
I understand. This is the character Dan, not the person Dan.
Right, yes. So the character Dan...
Loosely based on Dan.
Loosely based on Dan.
Without it being Dan at all.
Right.
Got it. Okay. All right. When you work on a script, do you work from an outline? Do you work outline out, or how do you do it?
Well, when we were at the Hub, we had to, because we had to get an outline approved before we went into that. But I actually found that the less detailed the outline was, the better the episode came out usually.
Was it easier to get them through when they were less detailed?
Sometimes.
Or did the executives want more information?
It really depended on which season, which executive.
So once they trusted that the show was working, they backed off you somewhat.
I would say they never trusted the show was working. I think that's just through the internal machinations of whatever's going on at the Hub. We had a couple of different executives, and so some of them were more sort of micromanagers than others.
How many total episodes were written over the whole length of the series?
53.
And how many of those did you write?
30-something.
And so did you then hire freelance writers?
Yes. Well, in seasons 2 and 3...
Because you didn't have a staff, right? You were the staff.
Well, so in the first season, it was Dan and me, and they brought in a creative consultant to sort of be they weren't going to let us run our own show from the get-go. So they brought in...
Is this Bruce?
No, actually, this was a guy named Rob Long.
Rob Long.
Who, he does a great podcast called Martini Shot on KCRW, and he used to be the showrunner on Cheers, and he co-created Sullivan and Son, I think, which was on TBS a little while ago.
Because you guys had never done a show before.
Right. So they wanted somebody
who trust you with it.
Exactly. So he came in, and he was great because he didn't write any episodes, but he'd always throw in, sometimes the funniest line in an episode. But also he was very invested in, he basically, his mentality was, I'll give you the best advice I can, and then you can decide whether to take it or not, because it's your show, not mine.
Well,
so
that's helpful.
It was fantastic. There was a guy who was in for the first month before him who was not as helpful, and there were some clashes there.
But he wound up going bye-bye.
Well, so then Rob couldn't commit to, because Sullivan and Son was starting up in season 2, and so he couldn't commit to the same time. And so Jay Fukuda, who was the head of Film Roman, who was our animation studio.
Yes, who I worked with at Disney.
Right. Brought in a guy named Bruce Ferber, who is a friend of yours.
Well, he's been a guest on StoryBeat.
Okay. Well, he's a friend of mine. And so he came in for season 2.
That's how you and I got together, is through Bruce Ferber.
That's right.
So it's all one chain.
Yes.
It's a chain of events. All right, so you always then had someone with you who was slightly more up the level of Hollywood to sort of oversee things.
Right. And more to sort of run interference between the Hub Network and the writer's room. I think early on, maybe we had a thinner skins for criticism, and it was really nice to have Rob in the room to sort of, go back and forth before we learned to do it ourselves, and to say, okay, so this was a stupid note. Don't get mad about it. Figure out how you're going to address it or not address it. And
okay, this is valuable, what you just said. I find that most newer writers, ones that don't have any real professional experience yet, that they tend to be thin-skinned. This is my baby. Don't touch it. It's perfect the way it is.
Right.
We know what we're doing, and no one else does.
Yeah, and also you put so much of yourself into it, especially when it's your first script or first 5 scripts, first 10 scripts even. When somebody criticizes it, you feel like they're criticizing you. If this joke doesn't land, you think they're saying you're not funny.
Right.
Right. So, and that is something that I don't think there's an easy way to get over that except just by being in there and hearing the same, and sometimes the criticisms are way off and idiotic, and sometimes they're right, and learning to tell the difference between those two is, I think, one of the best skills you can learn.
Well, there's no doubt that a lot of notes in Hollywood are idiotic, but many of them are very helpful.
Right, and even some of the idiotic ones can be helpful if you say, okay, so this person obviously didn't get what I was trying to do here. How can I make that more clear?
Right.
Even if they're absolutely wrong in what they're saying, they can be right in that I can improve this anyway.
So I tell my screenwriting students all the time, this is exactly what you're saying, that when you get notes, take the notes. You don't have to accept the notes, but you should at least absorb them, because or you don't have to act on a note, but you need to hear it because someone was thrown off by it in some way. And so how can you address that to make things even better? And frequently that turns into a much better circumstance. And even if the note is not fully addressed, or you don't take their note, but it triggers something else that's better, because somebody, as we say, bumped on it.
Right. And there's a reason they bumped, well, possibly, or maybe they're just the wrong person for the script, but it's always worth taking a look at. I mean, when we'd get our pages of notes from the network, I sort of divided them into 3 categories, right? And the first one is like word tweaks, or, can we make the balloon red instead of blue? Like those things, you just absolutely accept those notes. Rob Long had a trick where he would occasionally say, "That was a fantastic note. This works so much better with a blue balloon." And sort of praise get the executive, thinking, "Wow, this guy's really on my team."
Did they get that they were being dissed?
Well, he wouldn't say dissed. He'd say it was handling, right? Like
handling.
And he does tell a funny story about one time when an executive was like, "Don't handle me," and he's like, "I'm not. It's just a great note, right?"
All right. So most.
So you get the minor notes that I just think you should just take all of.
I think you should take every note and say thank you very much.
Right, but I mean when addressing, yeah. So when you're doing the rewrite, so I always implemented all the minor notes, and then I would, sometimes then I would figure out the ones that like maybe this isn't the way that I do it, but it doesn't really harm the script, or maybe they had a really good point, and so you implement those notes, and then for the ones that you don't want to implement, half of them I would just ignore, because honestly, if the script goes back to them and it's different, they're not going to remember what they said the last time around.
So how many of those notes do you think are political? That is to say, you do them just to satisfy someone else, doesn't hurt the show, doesn't bother you that much. You could have left it the way it was, but you've changed it to satisfy someone's note for a political purpose.
I'd say about a third.
A third. Mm-hmm. I think that's important for people to know, that it's okay to address notes for political reasons within the context of your little tiny town called a show.
Right.
It's
well,
helpful.
because, and you hear this a lot, but people say everybody's trying to make the best show they can.
Right.
And that is both true, and also everybody also might have a very different vision for what the show is going to be. So you do have to protect your vision somewhat. But honestly, if somebody, if an executive says, "I hate the name Jennifer. I had an ex-girlfriend named Jennifer. Can we change this to Becky?" Change the name to Becky. Like, unless there's a reason that it has to be Jennifer, just play ball.
Right. Like, for instance, it's your daughter's name and you want it in that episode, then it becomes something to fight over.
Right. And then for notes I really disagreed with that I felt would negatively impact the story, sometimes I would I'd ask a clarifying question that was really a way for me to avoid doing the note. Like, I'd say, "Hey, when you say this doesn't work, is it for this reason, in which case I'll do A, or is it for this reason, in which case I'll do B?" And even if it was neither of those reasons, I think they felt compelled to pick one, and then I'd get a solution that I was okay with out of this bad note that I felt wasn't going to be good for the show.
Okay, so you've alluded to yet something else that I tell people all the time, which I think is great, which is the best way to handle notes that you don't agree with is to ask questions.
Right, because sometimes you'll get to, like, well, I didn't mean that the scene doesn't work. I meant that I didn't like this part of it.
Right.
Or sometimes, like I said, if you give them 2 options to fix the scene that you do agree with, then maybe you can steer them away from forcing you to change the scene in a way that you don't agree with. Yeah.
It's almost always better to make the person who's giving the note think that they're contributing to the change. Mm-hmm. It's just always better, because then they don't feel like you're threatening in any way.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of that goes on, because there's a certain amount of insecurity in this business, because who knows anything?
Right.
William Goldman said nobody knows anything. And there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, here's the thing. You can't give a script to an executive or to anyone who has some responsibility for it and say, "What do you think?" and have them say, "You know, it looks great." Like, if somebody says that to you, that means that your show's being canceled. Right, and they just don't care anymore. Like,
that's absolutely true, because they all, whoever they are, in whatever position they're in, if they have any influence on your show at all, they will want to feel like they're contributing, that they're earning their keep.
Right, because if they're not, then why are they there?
Right. Exactly right. So yeah, you're always fighting that a little bit, and people will frequently give notes because that's their job, is to give notes, and they know that the note is not necessarily going to be taken.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all really well.
Yep. So if you take the 60% of the notes that are minor, and take the 30% of the notes that you more or less agree with, or that you don't feel are negative, and then for the last 10%, you either ask questions to try to steer it in the right way, or like I said, for that last 5%, I'd just sort of ignore them because, again, if the script were significantly different when it came back, they wouldn't remember what they'd asked for last time.
So TV in particular is replete with stories of producers who take a note, say thank you very much, and then go off and do nothing, and then hand it back in and get a note back saying that's terrific what you did.
Right.
And there was nothing done.
Sometimes you need to, so you go through the script when it's in revision mode, and you'll delete a space and add a space so that you get the little asterisk by the side of it, so that it looks like you've made all these changes.
You're giving away a trick.
Right. But again, you only do that for 5% of the
or
notes,
you
right?
change one word.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly right. All right. So you were not just the writer and creator, but you were also one of the producers of the show, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So most producing and writing comes with a degree of pressure to produce on time, on deadline, and so on.
Yeah.
And to produce a certain way, and to make sure it has some aesthetic that's the same from episode to episode. Do you have any tried and true tricks to handle pressure?
Actually, I find that I do a lot better when I have some sort of deadline. When there's no reason for me to write any particular thing, I end up not writing anything for a very long time. Whereas, there's an old joke. In movies, you try to write until it's perfect. In TV, you write until it's Friday. And so in our first season, we had a new table read every week. And again, we didn't have a writing staff per se. So it was me and Dan, and then Rob Long in the first season, and then these really talented guys, Eric and Kirill, who came on board, and they were sort of somewhere in the first season. They were somewhere between writers' assistants and staff writers,
right?
But they weren't really full time in the first season, and so
they were sort of writing schleps, weren't they?
Yeah, well, they had. They eventually left because they were not getting good deals for their services at the Hub, and are successful today. So they're doing great. Don't worry about Eric and Kirill; they're fine.
All right. I've stopped worrying.
So we had a new table read every week in the first season, and I think Dan and we shared our writing credits in that first season. I think we're credited with maybe 18 out of the 22 episodes, and so every Monday, whatever you had, that was getting read in front of a bunch of people, and it was really great incentive to get stuff done.
Was it? I imagine sometimes that was terrifying.
It was always terrifying.
Always terrifying.
But yeah, on the other hand, it was also really, it was really productive. It was a very productive time because, like I said, whatever you had, that was getting read.
Well, nothing focuses the mind like a hard deadline.
Right. And so, I remember in season 2, there was it was Friday. We had just gotten the outline approved, which happened a lot for Monday's table read. And my daughter ended up going into the pediatric ICU.
Ooh.
And so I ended up, staying with her the first 8 hours. And basically after that, through the weekend, I'd sort of split my time between trying to get this episode done.
How did you manage to this is a good question. How did you manage to write comedy and snark and all the rest of it while you were thinking about your daughter?
Well, it was actually a really good escape from the and also I should say that it wasn't anything. When we didn't know what was going on, it was really terrifying. She just wasn't. She was having sort of a prolonged asthma attack.
Got it.
And so for the first night we were there, we had no idea what was going on, and her oxygen levels kept dipping, and it was really terrifying. And I didn't get anything done then. But once they sort of got it under control, then and we realized it wasn't life-threatening.
So therefore you were able to go back to.
So I was able to get back to
thinking again.
Yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise your brain just doesn't want to function.
Right, absolutely. But that episode actually ended up being one of my favorite of all of them. It was Dan versus the telemarketer. And
Dan versus the telemarketer.
Yeah. And I really liked that one. So
what made that episode special for you?
Well, we had so in season 1 we had John C. McGinley
yes
come in. Dr. Cox from Scrubs.
Right. And many movies.
Yes, and he was Dan versus Dan, and he was a guy that basically took Dan's identity. And at the end of that episode, Dan defeats him and sends him off to jail. And then Dan versus the telemarketer, Dan starts getting plagued by telemarketing calls, and you find out that it's this character who's returned to plague him again. And so he was just a lot of fun to work with, and the character was a lot of fun. And like I said, we went to some weird psychological places with it, about the nature of identity.
Mm-hmm. I think he's in the movie Identity. I could be wrong. He might be. Maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, me neither.
Which is a very interesting
Haven't seen
movie.
that in a while. Yeah,
it's a pretty good movie, but I don't know whether he's in that or not. Anyway, it's not relevant to what we're talking about.
Right.
Okay, so the old line is, dying is easy, comedy is hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost impossible to define, but do you know what makes comedy so difficult to do?
Well, for me, I don't think it is. I mean, I don't think it's as
easy
difficult as drama. Well, no, I mean, none of it's easy, but drama is so much harder for me that, and again, I can look at a page and tell you if a joke is funny. I can't look at a page and tell you if a scene is dramatic.
You can tell before anybody's read it out loud that joke's going to land.
Yeah. Yeah, or if it doesn't, then I feel like the problem's the audience.
That's interesting. If it doesn't land, it's the audience's problem. So in your mind's eye, it works.
Yeah, I think I can get
not.
a pretty good sense of how funny something is on the page.
And when you get it into a table read or into the studio, one of the two, and you get actors who are, I hope, plussing the work that's there, because the voice actors always plus what's there, if they're any good at all.
Yes, and ours were very good.
And most in Hollywood that are voice actors are very good, are surprisingly good, like really astonishing. When they plus it, do you then realize it wasn't what you thought it was? Or is it always, hey, they just took what I knew worked and just made it a little better?
I would say a lot of the time, so our voice cast were Curtis Armstrong, who's probably best known as Booger from Revenge of the Nerds.
Yes, but also on Moonlighting.
Yes, Moonlighting, and he shows up in supporting roles everywhere.
Lots of things,
yeah,
sure.
you can't turn on the TV or watch a movie without seeing him every once in a while.
I'm pretty sure he's in Risky Business.
Risky Business, Better Off Dead.
Yeah.
He was the Metatron in Supernatural for season after season.
Yeah.
So he was just fantastic. And then the person playing Chris was a guy named Dave Foley, who you might have heard of from Kids in the Hall,
News Radio. Sure.
Again, supporting roles in many, many things, and also a really talented writer himself.
Of course.
And then our Elise was Paget Brewster from Community, CSI, Andy Richter Controls the Universe. So just really astonishingly talented people. And they would, I would say a lot of the time they'd read the line like I thought they would read the line, and it was as funny as I thought it would be. And then every once in a while they would have a completely different reading that was so much funnier than, Curtis in particular just had these different levels and flavors of anger that he developed over the course of the show that just sold so many of the lines that, like, there would be lines where like, oh, that's all right. That's not, I didn't hit it out of the park on that one, but it's okay. And then Curtis would read it and I'd be like, I am a genius.
Well, so, that's the whole thing, is the actor brings that thing to life. And when it's on the page, that's why I'm curious that you're able to see it on the page, because sometimes I can see it and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have to hear it said, but you're saying in advance. I'm saying
I know, a lot more with comedy than with drama. Absolutely.
I find that fascinating. That's a skill set you're born with. That's not something that you can develop it, but I don't think that's something you can go get. You either have it or you don't.
Or maybe it's just maybe I'm just in touch with what my sense of humor is, right? Like if I think something's funny, sometimes an actor will read something and I'll be like, well, that's not how I had it in my head.
Can you read an unproduced comedy script from someone else, not your show, just a totally, pilot or a feature that someone else has written, and can you tell on the page whether the jokes land or not?
I think so.
So in other words, it's all in your reading and that sensibility.
Yes.
I submit to you that you cannot. I can't train you to do that. I can take what you have and make it better, but you have to be born with that. I think that's
an interesting idea.
There's maybe nature versus nurture in there, where you were brought up in a way that the nurturing helped that to develop. But I think that you have to have that sensibility, because I don't know about you, but I know plenty of people that don't have a sense of humor at all. And so if they hear it, let alone read it, they won't have a clue.
A lot of executives, probably.
and a few in management every once in a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes agents. That's sad.
It is. That's true. That's unfortunate, but it's true. All right, so comedy and writing for TV both tend to be collaborative in nature. And even though you were writing a lot of things on your own, you still had to collaborate with people. You didn't do all the voices, you didn't draw it, you didn't produce it, you didn't raise the money. It's a collaborative business.
Yes.
What would you say, working on a show that has many different fingers in that pie, what would you say makes a good collaboration work?
Well, obviously the people that you're working with are of primary importance there,
Sure.
right? So we had some really wonderful artists, and a lot like the actors, sometimes they draw something, like that's not how I saw that character at all, but it works. It's great. It fits within the style of the show.
What would happen if it didn't work? Because that had to have happened over 53 episodes.
And that's where you sort of have to get some there's a lot of trust involved. So we had a really fantastic supervising director named Brian Sheasley. And, if something wasn't quite flying for us, we could pull him aside and say, hey, Brian, this scene where this is happening, could we speed this up a little, or could we try to convey this in a different way?
Right.
And he was really open and receptive. And likewise, if he said, hey, we're having a little trouble boarding this, can we make it this way? Then he could come to us.
Was he also your voice director?
So actually, Dan Mandel did a lot of the
voice direction.
Yeah, he'd sit in, like I said, as an actor by trade. He just had a better ear for that kind of thing than I did. So we always had Brian would always sit in, and he would be the person sort of calling the shots. But as far as Dan and me, our influence on the voice stuff, Dan would always sit in the booth. I'd rather be off in my cubicle writing.
Okay. So. All right. So, okay, back to what makes a good collaboration work.
So I think having trust in the other people with you. We got really lucky with Brian. Again, we had a director early on that we did not get along with so well, and I think the first half of our first season in particular is pretty rocky for a lot of the conflict reasons.
That's common.
But once you get into a space where you can go to the person, you can talk to them, and nobody's going to get their hackles up, and you're not going to get your hackles up when they say, hey, that we're having trouble with this scene,
It's a professional conversation about how do you solve a problem.
Right.
Not you suck.
It's not an attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Which does happen on some shows.
It does.
But when it works, it's really a professional exchange of, this is not working for me. How can we make this better?
Yeah, and Brian Sheasley in particular was just so wonderful about, here's a story about him, which so my parents came in to visit and I was taking them around the production, the studio and stuff. Yeah, the office. And Brian came up to me and he asked me a question that I was like, this didn't seem like a big question, right? Like it was, it was something like, in the scene, Dan has an axe. Is it a fire axe or is it a wood chopping axe or whatever?
Right.
And didn't think anything of it. And then maybe a month or two later, my wife's parents were in town, and I took them around, gave them the tour, and he did the same thing again. I was like, why is he? And then I realized that he wanted to give me the appearance of being the decision maker and the person in charge in front of my parents or my in-laws. And I hadn't even thought about it, but it was just a really kind and thoughtful and unnecessary, but a really nice thing for him to do, right?
I'd say
so he was just that kind of guy.
That's what we would call a mensch.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really that is a thoughtful thing to do.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of directors wouldn't think about you at all.
I wouldn't even, I consider myself a relatively nice person, but I wouldn't think to do that for somebody, right?
Well, but now that you've seen it happen twice,
yes,
you might think about doing that in the future on a show.
That's right.
And if somebody's parents come in, you might actually go up and try and make them look good.
Yes.
Yeah, I think any time in this industry that you can make other people look good, you look good.
Yeah. Well, and Brian in particular had no reason to, he's got primetime Emmys, he's got daytime Emmys, he's been around the block a few times. And I think that the reason that everybody loves working with him is because he is that sort of kind and thoughtful and he's not a jerk. So it's really so again, as far as the collaboration goes, when he comes in and has a question or a problem, you listen to him because he's not doing it out of ego.
Do you find anything in collaboration that is disadvantageous?
Well, I think sometimes you get the too many cooks in the kitchen.
Too many people want to throw their ideas in, and the whole thing becomes a stew.
Yeah, and again, when it does become about ego, I think that's a problem too. When somebody feels like I'm not presenting, hopefully everybody's working towards a greater goal of making the best show they can make. Sometimes people just want to get something in so they can point to it and say, I did that.
Right.
So I think that's when there's too much of that, you get a little.
What would you
get in trouble.
What would you say is the biggest disaster you ran into, and how did you solve it?
Ooh, boy.
Something's just falling apart, and how did you solve that problem?
Well,
I'm talking about story-wise and production-wise, not necessarily interpersonal-wise.
Okay, because, it's all related, though, right?
It is, certainly.
So, yeah, without naming names, we did have a creative consultant who was on before Rob Long, who just...
wasn't on the same page with you at all.
Yeah, I think that's the nicest possible way to put it. We did not get along. And he kind of felt like, I've done this before and you haven't, so,
I know everything. And
you
know nothing.
Right. And at one point he wrote a really sort of condescending email about, guys, the network brought me in for a reason, and that reason is basically that you don't know what you're doing, and sort of implied that he was shielding us from the network seeing just how awful we were, and, just really sort of undercutting. And he said, they didn't come in and say, hey, Dan and Chris have this brilliant show and they're geniuses and just write down everything they say. They brought me in because I know what I'm doing and you don't, basically.
Right.
And so I wrote an email back saying, basically, it started with, yes, but they also didn't say, hey, we've got this awful show run by idiots and we need you to ride in on your white effing horse and save the day. So we had some issues, at which point the executive producer, Dan Angel, sort of came in and said, you guys have to work this out. Like this is, we're all on the same team here. And
Sure.
If you guys can, and he was sort of being the parent in that situation, but he hadn't been in the writer's room with us. And so also, I would say this also, the guy just had some weird ideas about what the show should be and what was funny that
differed from yours.
Yeah.
You had true creative differences.
Yeah, but also...
which is a term often used to mean we just don't like each other.
Right. Well, this was both. So finally, I just said, I'm just not going to worry about this. I'm going to let this guy turn in his terrible, terrible script to the executive producers. And basically, he turned in his script, and they said, we can't give this to the network. You need to rewrite it. At which point, he went behind their backs to the network and said, the executive producers are giving me a lot of trouble. And, I guess he didn't know that they had all worked together at the production company that optioned us in the first place. And he sort of shot himself in the foot and was asked, I don't know if he was asked to leave or if it just got uncomfortable enough that he just left. But he kind of got rid of himself, so...
that's that's the best way for that to end, is that he self-terminated.
Right.
Well, and then you wound up with Rob Long.
Yes,
and then
who was awesome, and then Bruce Ferber,
who was also awesome.
Yes.
I no doubt Bruce Ferber was outstanding.
Oh, he was great.
All right, so what for you? This is a question I like to ask lots of guests, and I think a difficult question to get to the answer. What for you makes a good story good?
I think what makes a good story good, you hear a lot about character, right? And character development and character interaction. I would say the best stories get to an ending that seems like it was inevitable at the end, but you didn't see coming, right? Like
that's very good.
I think that
and satisfying.
Yeah, like if you see an underdog sports movie, you're pretty sure you know how it's going to play out, right? And then, but then I think probably when the people saw Rocky for the first time, like he loses at the end of the first Rocky movie, right?
Yeah.
But like he gets his self-respect and he earns so much more. And
well, doesn't he tie? Isn't it a split decision?
it's split decision, but he still loses the bout, right?
Right.
Like he's not the champion at the end of the
Right,
first
exactly.
Rocky movie. And then, but then by the end of the fourth Rocky movie, you kind of know how it's going to go, right? So,
Exactly. Or Rambo.
right.
You know how they're going to end.
And even then, the first Blood movie was amazing. It was so good.
And so what you're saying is, which I think is a very valuable take on it, which is it needs to be something that we know what's going to happen, but we don't know how it's going to happen.
Right. Right. And also, I mean, yeah, because you wouldn't want to watch an underdog sports movie where halfway through the movie they all quit the soccer team and start a coffee shop, right?
They just all, yes, that's right, they just quit.
Right. Or they go into space. I mean, like you just, so yeah, you do sort of set up some expectations, but when you arrive at a conclusion that seems like it couldn't have gone any other way, but that you still didn't see coming.
They all become pet trainers.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
That's not going to work, not at all.
So that's what I love about stories is when you get surprised. I also love watching movies. Like I remember when I sat in the Sixth Sense for the first time, and I'm a quarter of the way into the movie, and I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Next. Yeah.
And if you go back and watch that movie again, all of it is right there in front of you.
Right.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
That movie is truly brilliant. And occasionally, M. Night Shyamalan is also good, and occasionally he's really not good at all. But when he's on, he's really on, and you don't know what's coming next. And yet, when you go back and review it, it's all there.
Yeah.
And that movie in particular, Sixth Sense, everything is right in front of your eyes.
Right.
The entire movie, and you don't see it. My ex-wife actually, 3 minutes into the movie, said, "I know what this is," and she was right. So sometimes that doesn't work so well, but for me, I didn't get it at all till the very end.
Yep.
Which is exactly what it should be.
Yeah.
All right. So surely in your career, you must have met some or had experiences with some very unusual people or circumstances. Can you relate to us an oddball, a weird, a quirky, funny, offbeat, strange story, or just plain funny story that's happened to you?
Yes. So, I will tell you the story of the worst pitch meeting I ever had.
Worst pitch ever.
So this was really early on. This was my first writing partner in L.A., a good friend of mine. And
You want to tell us his name or not?
his name is Alan Piper.
Alan Piper.
Great guy. We had our first meeting, not our first meeting, this was maybe our second meeting of all time. Like we'd just gotten an agent. We were right out of the gate. And so, of course, we assumed that we would take a meeting, pitch something. They'd say, of course, and then we're writing movies for the studios, right? So we walk in, first meeting, it's Dimension Films, and it's a guy named Michael Zumas. I don't know if he's still there or not.
Mm-hmm.
But we had this sort of, lower to mid-budget. We wanted to create a new Jason, a new Freddy, a new unstoppable killing machine, right? Like it was a horror movie, obviously. So we went in and we pitched basically it was called, what was it called? It's called Misery Island, and it was about...
Misery Island.
Yeah, which is a real place off of Salem, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So it was about a guy basically who sells his soul for revenge and then comes back as an unstoppable killing machine, right? And so we pitch it to him, and he listens and he nods, and he pauses for a second, he goes, "Could we make him a serial rapist?" And Alan and I looked at each other and we're like, sorry? And he goes, because I guess he had seen some play in which this woman, somebody broke into her apartment to attempt to rape her, and she fought him off and then tortured him for the rest of the play, and he thought that was really awesome. And so he's like, so could we do that? And, here's the thing. This is our second meeting of all time, right? So if somebody said that to us today, we'd walk out and go, well, that guy's crazy, and just right off the meeting, right? But we thought this is, if we make this guy happy, this is our key to writing a Dimension film, right? So we went home and we
Thought about it.
We wrote a new outline, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense to us. But so instead of selling his soul to get revenge, now this guy's a serial rapist, and he breaks into this woman's house, and she gets the upper hand on him. But then she's like a Wiccan, so she tries to cast a spell on him, and it goes wrong and turns him into an unstoppable killing machine, and then we're back into the Jason or Freddy thing, right?
How'd that go?
Well, so here's the thing, though. So we pitched it we went back to Michael Zumas, and he's like, that sounds fantastic. And so he took us upstairs to his boss, who, I don't know if he was the decision maker or just, sort of the next rung up on the...
Right.
So we do our whole, serial rapist dog and pony show, and the guy listening to us very politely, and he goes, I just don't really understand this, this woman, somebody breaks into her apartment and tries to rape her. She gets the upper hand on him. Why doesn't she call the police instead of trying to cast a spell on him? At which point Michael Zumas turns to us and goes, that was my concern. And we're like, yeah, that's a terrible idea. It was your idea. Right? I mean, we didn't say that in the room. I think I would have in retrospect. Well, I wouldn't have gotten into the situation at all in retrospect. But yeah, it was just this really hilarious, like, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, well, and that story, I assume in many different ways has played out in your life where somebody has said something in a room that was like, that can't be right. What did they read what we wrote? Right?
Yes. Yeah. You get a lot of like, did you read the same thing that I sent you, or is this like some dream you had?
All right. So what's the best piece of advice or a good tip that you can give to those who are starting out in the business today, or maybe are in a little bit but looking to take it to the next level?
Okay. Well, if you are just starting out in the business today, I would say utilize every contact that you have. Like when I moved out there, I had this notion that like, oh, I don't want help from people. I want to make it on my own, right? Which is ridiculous.
That's
and
ridiculous.
So
that's right.
far away from reality that, it's like, it's like childlike in a way, right? Yeah, so if you have a cousin who went to college with somebody who works in the mailroom of an agency, use that contact. If you, if you're reading something about some production company executive who went to the same college as you, when you write that letter, say, hey, I went to, or grew up in the same town, or like however tenuous, however, I would say that's my main piece of advice is that at the beginning, it's a lot less about the writing and a lot more about getting your writing in front of people.
Contacts.
Because especially with comedy, but I think with drama too, you never know what somebody's tastes are going to be, what somebody's sensibilities. You can make the best strawberry ice cream in the world, but if somebody wants chocolate, they're not going to buy it. So you've got to get your stuff out there and seen by people.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that, like I said, utilize every contact. I would also say don't worry about bothering people. Because one of two things will happen. If you try to get somebody to read your script, they will either tell you yes and they will read your script, or they will tell you no and forget about you immediately. Like you have to go really above and beyond to get anybody to remember you from a no, right?
Unless you're a stalker.
Yeah, and even then, light stalking,
Light stalking. Wow.
No, but like if you're submitting something to a production company and you have like. Absolutely. Google, Wikipedia, learn everything you can about everyone who works there. And then, like I said, if you have a contact or something in common with one of them, mention that when you're attempting to submit your material.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really, truly valuable advice. And for more than one reason, because when you finally make that contact with that person, they, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, they may not want what you've provided to them,
Mm-hmm.
but they may find in you something that's valuable for something else. And so it's a numbers game, essentially. It's
Right.
a sales game. You need to get in front of as many people as you can, and you need to make as many contacts as you can.
Yeah, well, the way that I think about it is there are two types of people who make it in Hollywood, right? And the first type is, the people who have made it before they even walk through the door.
Mm-hmm.
My uncle runs the studio, or, whatever. My dad's an executive somewhere,
Right.
or, I went to Harvard with the showrunner on this and this.
Right.
And so they have no problem,
They're
like
already connected in some
right.
way.
There are people who drive out from Harvard, having worked on the Lampoon, and have a writer's assistant position or better lined up for them before they come out.
Sure.
Most people aren't one of those people. And so the other type of people are the ones who basically go out there and bang their heads against the wall for 10 years until lightning finally strikes and they get in, right? But every single person, I took a survey of all my working writer friends, and I said, how did you get your first job and how did you get the job you have now? And all of them except me, basically, and actually Eric and Krill, the guys who worked for us, had the same story, which was, I had some tenuous connection to some showrunner, and I got my material in front of them because my college roommate was best friends with his girlfriend or whatever it was. And, through whatever avenues they could work, they got their material in front of the people.
I would say that's also quite a common story, that it's sometimes the thinnest most tenuous connection gets you in the door, and you just don't know where that's coming from. What you don't want to be is the person that the person on the receiving end thinks is going to hurt them. And there are people like that that are a little scary. So you want to be smart about it, but at the same time, it is a matter of being. And when you talk about the 10 years, it is persistence. There, what they say at UCLA in the graduate school there is the only people who don't succeed in some way are people who give up. So it's persistence.
Or get hit by a bus.
Well, that's a kind of giving up, I guess. But yes, or get hit by a bus, and please don't do that.
Right. I would advise against that for people just starting out. Try not to get hit by a bus.
Well, I think this is all very valuable stuff, and this has been a lot of valuable information today. Chris, I greatly appreciate you coming into the studio today. It's been a terrific interview, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.